Welcome to Charles Dickens' A Brain on Fire, a series that digs deep into the life and works of one of the greatest novelists of all time. Imagine a bright and brilliant chemist who takes the stage to deliver thrilling lectures to his students. This teacher, on whose lips and hands a crowd of aspiring ears and eyes are hung. And now, imagine, a heavy curtain in a wall that separates this bright theatre from the dark lodgings where the chemist retires each day to sit by the fire among his drugs, instruments, and books, moving his silent mouth as in speech, but silent as the dead. While all around him the quaint objects by firelight cast monstrous shadows on the walls as he listens to some old echoes in his mind that carry him to a bygone place and time. This is the setting of Dickens's final Christmas book, The Haunted Man and the Ghost's Bargain, written in that turbulent year of 1848. It's a deeply powerful story, where the chemist Stephen Redlaw is offered a chance to forget all his painful memories by a phantom who is a ghastly copy of himself drawn from the shadows in his study. Redlaw accepts the ghost's bargain, but then faces a desperate struggle to have this spell lifted again, when to his horror he discovers that his new gift has a King Midas quality of infecting everyone he meets, or nearly everyone, with the same curse of forgetting. Light in the story comes in the form of Millie, one of Dickens's good little women, and a ministering angel to the people around her. Millie, her sparky husband William Swidger, and her ancient father-in-law Philip quietly try to help Stephen, turning up the lamps and decorating his study with that powerful wintry emblem, holly. Here, to light a path through this extraordinary book, is the inimitable Dr. Lydia Craig, lecturer in English at the University of Eastern Illinois. Lydia co-authored the verse of Charles Dickens for Edinburgh University Press, and she specializes in 19th century race and gender and the English novel. She is both associate editor of the Dickensian and the Charles Dickens Letters Project, co-editor of Dickens Search, and treasurer of the Dickens Society. Lydia, hello. Welcome to Charles Dickens' A Brain on Fire. It's fantastic to have you here to talk to us about The Haunted Man and the Ghost's Bargain.
Thank you for having me. It's actually one of my favorite Christmas books by Dickens, and I feel like people don't really talk about it as much, at least until recent years. So very happy to be here.
So where do we start with this one? You say it's one of your favorites. Why is that? What is it about it that's so special to you?
Well, it's one of the most fascinating psychological short stories I think that Dickens ever wrote.
Yeah, you using the term psychological, I mean, that's exactly it, isn't it? I often read it like everything's happening in Redlaw's head, almost. I mean, Dickens at the end, I think, even suggests that some people say this was just Redlaw sitting by the fire and thinking up all this stuff when we get to the end.
Right.
But the darkness of his study and characters creeping in and coming in and going out again. Yeah, it's so powerful. And there are some fantastic poetic prose sections to it. He's right back on form, isn't he? Because I think the one before it, The Battle of Life, is considered a little bit of an outlier, not a favourite amongst many people.
One thing that was interesting to me is that Dickens actually came up with this idea for this last Christmas book when he was writing The Battle of Life. So there was this struggle, I think, because I personally think that he wanted to write this book instead of The Battle of Life, but it was too far gone. He had deadlines. And so he wrote to Forster in late summer of 1846. And he said, "I have been dimly conceiving a very ghostly and wild idea, which I suppose must now be reserved for the next Christmas book." So then he came back to it in September 1847, but he was still writing Dombey and Son. And so then he put this off until October 1848 and then finished it at Brighton on the 30th of November. And then it was published on the 19th of December, 1848. So that's almost 2 years of thinking about this book and just sort of mulling it over in his mind. So I think he had more preparation time for this one than maybe for any of the other ones.
Do you know if he put pen to paper at all in 1847, or did he have to really hold back and really start in 1848 on it?
So we know that he sent a few pages to Forster. And so this was in September 1847, so about a year after he first had the idea. He wrote a few pages and he sent them to Forster. We don't know, though, if he discarded these and started over. From some of the things he wrote, it seems like he just started from the beginning again. But this would make it his second draft that he did for this story. So I think he had time to sort of shape it, think about it. There was also the fact that his sister had just died when he went back to it in 1848, and he worked that into the plot. There's a scene where Redlaw talks about his sister and her death, and so that was something that I think Dickens was able to bring into the grief that he's experiencing, those negative feelings. It's what he's going through at the time. He's only a few months out from losing his closest sibling.
Yeah, that is amazing, because I think in that moment, Redlaw, this is right at the end, isn't it? Redlaw's talking about his long-lost sister, the sister that is long lost to Redlaw over many, many years, and it's very raw and recent for Dickens. And 1848 also is a bit of a seismic year for the world, isn't it? It's a bit of a brutal time of serious social upheaval and revolution across Europe as well. Yeah. So I think that probably plays into the story a little bit as well.
One thing that fascinates me about this book is that it seems to recycle some characters from A Christmas Carol. One of them being, if you remember the scene where the ghost of Christmas Present, where the two children, Ignorance and Want, are at the foot of the ghost of Christmas Present. That's the scene, that when I was a child, I was cowering as I watched the George C. Scott version, these two little...
Oh, yeah, the same thing happened to me. That George C. Scott version is absolutely terrifying in that moment, isn't it?
My mother was a theater actress, and so she would actually act it out for me sometimes, where she would be the ghost of Christmas Present, just, pointing to the children at the feet. And it was just this horrifying moment. So this actually came from Carlyle, Carlyle's French Revolution. He describes these two figures as children. So Dickens took that and made it, I think, more memorable in A Christmas Carol. Now, in The Haunted Man, we have the figure of that street urchin, this child that is bestial and wolfish and can't even understand love. You try to put the child in the house and feed them, and this child is unable to even comprehend that kind of care. And so I think this is Dickens saying to his audience, I told you.
A bundle of tatters, held together by a hand, in size and form almost an infant, but in its greedy, desperate little clutch, a bad old man's. A face rounded and smooth by some half-dozen years, but pinched and twisted by the experiences of a life. Bright eyes, but not youthful. Naked feet, beautiful in their childish delicacy, ugly in the blood and dirt that cracked upon them. A baby savage, a young monster, a child who had never been a child, a creature who might live to take the outward form of man, but who, within, would live and perish a mere beast.
We're in 1848. Famine is everywhere. Society is collapsing. It's because we failed to learn this Christmas message that if you don't take care of society, if you don't take care of your poor, eventually this comes back and will haunt you as well.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned, the Ignorance and Want characters, because in that child, who obviously is actually probably a prototype for Joe the crossing sweeper as well, in Bleak House coming up, is that Dickens uses the words pinched and twisted at one point to describe him, which are exactly the same words, as you know, to describe Ignorance and Want in A Christmas Carol. So yes, there are these echoes around the chamber in this one of A Christmas Carol all over the place. I can really see that. Do you think, just at this juncture, because obviously a lot of the listeners are very eminent Dickens scholars, and so they know The Haunted Man, but there are quite a few out there that might never have looked at it or read it. How, and good luck, how on earth would you try to summarize the story in some way and introduce some of the key characters for us?
So what this begins with is a scene that in a way reminds me of Edinburgh rather than London, but it sort of has this ambiance where you see the dark, shadowy side of a city at night as things are winding down. But it becomes very sinister. Night is falling, and with that, the shadows, which are the ghosts of people's regrets and their fears, their longings.
You should have seen him in his dwelling about twilight in the dead winter time. when the wind was blowing shrill and shrewd with the going down of the blurred sun, when it was just so dark as that the form of things were indistinct and big but not wholly lost, when sitters by the fire began to see wild faces and figures, mountains and abysses, ambuscades and armies in the coals, when people in the streets bent down their heads and ran before the weather, when those who were obliged to meet it were stopped at angry corners, stung by wandering snowflakes alighting on the lashes of their eyes, which fell too sparingly and were blown away too quickly to leave a trace upon the frozen ground.
Dickens actually, we know, thought about making this a revenge story. He wrote revenge as one of the ideas, and then he crossed through it and wrote no on the side. So people furious about where they are in life right now. Instead of having people do revenge, he has them instead just succumb to depression. So we have this entire city, but we focus on Redlaw. He is a chemist. He teaches at the school. Boys are his students. And he has a servant, William Swidger, who is also more of a friend in a way. It seems like he's one of the only people who talks to him in a familiar way, even though it's mostly a monologue. And he eventually, there are a few scenes where he meets Swidger's extended family. So this is his father, who is old and 87, and then his wife, Millie, who is actually referred to as Mrs. William sometimes, even though her name is technically Mrs. Swidger. So she is the cook and also the confidant of most of the young students at this school. And she is the force for good in this book, whereas Redlaw is eventually a force of almost pervasive evil. He just sort of sucks the life out of all the people around him. But the short version of this is that his thoughts, as Redlaw sitting there pondering over his difficult life, become personified as this doppelganger character who, in this very famous illustration, stands behind him, and they're both very sharp, angular features just staring at the fire.
As the gloom and shadow thickened behind him, in that place where it had been gathering so darkly, it took, by slow degrees, or out of it there came by some unreal, unsubstantial process, not to be traced by any human sense, an awful likeness of himself. Ghastly and cold, colourless in its leaden face and hands, but with his features and his bright eyes and his grizzled hair, and dressed in the gloomy shadow of his dress, it came into his terrible appearance of existence, motionless, without a sound. As he leaned his arm upon the elbow of his chair, ruminating before the fire, it leaned upon the chair back close above him with its appalling copy of his face, looking where his face looked, and bearing the expression his face bore.
So this character, whether it's real or not, this evil other, gives Redlaw the ability to have people forget the worst that has happened to them, the negative things in life. And I think there's an expectation from Redlaw, at least when he accepts this gift, that he will be helping them by taking away this pain and the sorrow that they've experienced. But what he eventually discovers through several scenes is that whenever he is able to, touch somebody or be in their presence, the contagion of that gift spreads to them, and then they become cruel and vicious because they have not been softened by the memory of their grief and their pain. Eventually, of course, he realizes that this is not a gift, this is a curse, and tries to undo it before it infects Millie, who is the story's better angel.
Yeah, well done. It's a tricky one it's great. So yes, it begins in Redlaw's study, doesn't it? In Jerusalem Gardens, where he teaches, and he's depressed. And you were saying about Swidger, his serving man Swidger, talking at him incessantly, and he's replying in monosyllables. And I wrote down, I think his responses, I think he only comes up to about 10 syllables sentences when old Philip brings in the holly, and there's the key magical ingredient. The chemist pushed his plate away, and, rising from the table, walked across the room to where the old man stood, looking at a little sprig of holly in his hand. "It recalls the time when many of those years were old and new, then," he said, observing him attentively, and touching him on the shoulder. "Does it?" "Oh, many, many," said Philip, half awaking from his reverie. "I'm 87. "Merry and happy, was it?" asked the chemist in a low voice. "Merry and happy, old man?" "Maybe as high as that. No higher," said the old man, holding out his hand a little way above the level of his knee and looking retrospectively at his questioner. "When I first remember him. Cold, sunshiny day it was, out a-walking when someone— it was my mother, as sure as you stand there, though I don't know what her blessed face was like, for she took ill and died that Christmas time— told me they were food for birds. The pretty little fellow thought, that's me, you understand, that birds' eyes were so bright, perhaps, because the berries that they lived on in the winter were so bright. I recollect that, and I'm 87.
The holly represents life, I think, or memory. There's a phrase that keeps being repeated over and over, especially ironically, because old Mr. William is obviously losing his faculties somewhat, but he'll say something like, "Lord, keep my memory green." And so it's a desire maybe for a legacy after your life is over.
And it's also that "Lord, keep my memory green" is like the counter spell to the forgetfulness spell that plagues
Right.
the characters. Yeah. So the fact that if you can remember,
Mm-hmm.
and actually the green again, that
Right.
green makes me think of Bob Cratchit talking about how green the place is where Tiny Tim is buried as a way of remembrance as well. And when old Philip gets infected, I think, with the loss, he tries to say something and then he says something about how it's broken off what he wanted to say. So it's like a twig or
Right.
a leaf on a branch that's snapped off and you're left with the trunk. It's so profound. With this book, you go deeper and deeper into the psychology and you find these things every time you look at it, I think. It is a very hopeful, cheerful book at the end, isn't it? The journey you go through is quite hard work. It's not fed to you with sugar.
Well, I think speaking to that idea of memory, it's such a double-edged sword. There are wonderful things in life that you can remember, experiences that keep people able to continue despite what's happening in their circumstances, but it also can be a torture, which I think is what Redlaw is experiencing at the beginning of the book.
Everybody said he looked like a haunted man. The extent of my present claim for everybody is that they were so far right. He did. Who could have seen his hollow cheek, his sunken, brilliant eye, his black-attired figure, indefinably grim, although well-knit and well-proportioned, his grizzled hair hanging like tangled seaweed about his face, as if he had been through his whole life a lonely mark for the chafing and beating of the great deep of humanity, but might have said he looked like a haunted man.
I think with the Switchers, you see a decision from the beginning to be cheerful. In particular, Millie has lost a child, and that seems to have been an idea that Dickens came to rather late. That's what Ruth Glancy and a few other scholars think about this. He invented this sort of halfway through the draft, and so it becomes a reason for why she is mothering so many other people, but she herself doesn't seem to have this legacy. This is an era where to be a mother is your purpose as a woman in many ways, as well as a housekeeper and a nurturer, but you're expected to have children. And Mr. Swidger seems to have rationalized this. We're happy as we are. And that's a decision to make the most of a bad situation, just like she is able to sort of devote her energies to helping young people, children. They've made peace with it. And so to have Redlaw come in there and disturb that, I think is just a piece of impudence. He doesn't even know what they've gone through to reach that kind of peace, but he thinks he knows better because of his own pain, which I think is a very interesting psychological moment in the book.
Yeah. And you think he learns that lesson later on, though, because he becomes almost Millie's disciple, doesn't he? I think it even describes his stature essentially shrinking next to her. Little Millie, whose nickname is Little Mouse or something. Very Victorian, isn't it? Of course. But
Very Dickensian.
yes, exactly. But Redlaw learns, despite all his learning, he really learns from Millie there. There's something also that I was very struck by, which is the nature of this Midas touch that Redlaw gets with this curse of people forgetting their painful memories, is the substance of it. And I only got it reading it again, preparing for this talk with you right now, Lydia, is that the substance of this curse isn't like a fairy godmother waving a wand and then suddenly you've turned into a tree or something. It's not instantaneous and it's not complete. That actually, even under the curse, the contagion, it has the substance of a fog. It's sort of referred to as a kind of fog that passes and goes. And then there's this internal struggle of light trying to break through that cloud in your vision of memory. Somewhere in there's a question, but I wondered if we could try and sort of unpick that a little bit, because that is fascinating.
Absolutely. I think it's about emotional contagion. As an actor, you're probably aware that you can tell if something's off with a member of the cast or, with yourself. So sometimes that thing you can't put your finger on changes the entire mood of the production and things start dragging or people start questioning what they're involved in. And so I think Dickens was playing with some of this knowledge that if you are emotionally attuned to someone and you can tell that they're off in some way or that they're depressed, that eventually can become contagious. And it doesn't happen all at once. It happens by degrees. And this is what I think happens in the story. So even by Redlaw being in the room with someone, being close to them in proximity, they're going to get infected. It's really horrific.
Yeah.
But brilliant.
And I suppose there are degrees of infection depending on his closeness to you, whether he's physically touched you or whether you've just seen, I think, because there's the characters of the Tetterbys, which we haven't talked about yet, but Mrs. Tetterby, I think she doesn't even get that close to him, does she? To be thrown out of sorts for a little bit. I think she just sees him looking at her or something, and that sends her off. It sends her into a little bit of a spiral, and she comes back out of it and then goes back into it again when he returns. She pointed to a pale man in a black cloak who had come into the room. "Look at that man! Look there! What does he want?" "My dear," returned her husband, "I'll ask him if you'll let me go. What's the matter? How you shake?" "I saw him in the street when I was out just now. He looked at me and stood near me. I'm afraid of him." "Afraid of him? Why?" "I don't know why. Stop, husband!" For he was going towards the stranger. She had one hand pressed upon her forehead and one upon her breast, and there was a peculiar fluttering all over her, and a hurried, unsteady motion of her eyes, as if she had lost something. "Are you ill, my dear?" "What is it that is going from me again?" she muttered in a low voice. "What is this that is going away?" Then she abruptly answered, "Ill? No, I am quite well," and stood looking vacantly at the floor. That idea that even when Redlaw himself, who has the superdose of it, it's not instantaneous, that he still has regret. He has regret at what he cannot remember to be regretful of, strangely, which is so hard to grasp, isn't it? It's so hard to sort of understand, and it takes a couple of reads to try and take that in.
It's fascinating, I think, this idea of grievance. I think that by now, over years, presumably, of brooding over this kind of situation, having this kind of evil familiar who's constantly whispering discontent into his ears, this has become Redlaw's personality. He is a very depressed person who perhaps doesn't even understand the full extent of why he is upset and depressed. And in the case of Mrs. Tetterby, she has so many children. And I think one of the saddest characters is actually poor Johnny, because he's always having to mind the baby, and he's a child.
Whenever Johnny wanted to go out, Moloch was asleep and must be watched. Whenever Johnny wanted to stay at home, Moloch was awake and must be taken out. Yet Johnny was verily persuaded that it was a faultless baby without its peer in the realm of England, and was quite content to catch meek glimpses of things in general from behind its skirts, or over its limp flapping bonnet, and to go staggering about with it like a very little porter with a very large parcel, which was not directed to anybody, and could never be delivered anywhere.
He's raising this child, and he also is influenced by Redlaw. I think he pinches or slaps the baby at one point because it won't stop teething
Yeah.
and crying. And they're not in a great situation. And the effort that it might take them to appear pleasant or kind to each other might be greater than for some other people who don't have as many cares. So I do think it's interesting that, only a slight touch or a slight influence can still have serious consequences.
Yeah. And the Tetterbees themselves, I mean, as I was reading it, and I don't know if this is fair to say or not, but they're almost like a more psychologically complex version of the Cratchits in many ways.
Yeah.
They have way more light and shade to them, don't they? And like you said, when they turn on each other, it's horrible. And they obviously come back out of it again. But yes, poor Johnny crushing himself under the weight of the baby that's has double tooth, as Dickens says at one point, and uses a nutmeg grater at the end to help with its teething. Yeah. If you had to explain the Tetterbees a little bit to us, what would you say about them? What springs out first of all?
So they have a shop and they sell literature. So I think there's some kind of sly allusion perhaps to Dickens. He's looking at this family with a lot of children who are in the literature trade, though a bit below where he is. And, there might be some ironic displacement of his own feelings at having so many children to support and, always having to worry about bills and such. So there is that. But, obviously they're very poor compared to Dickens even. So there's a description of this shop, which not only has literature, but all kinds of things in it, just like Mr. Venus's shop and Our Mutual Friend.
Tetterbees was the corner shop in Jerusalem buildings. There was a good show of literature in the window, chiefly consisting of picture newspapers out of date and serial pirates and footpads. Walking sticks likewise, and marbles were included in the stock in trade. It had once extended into the light confectionery line, but it would seem that those elegancies of life were not in demand about Jerusalem buildings, for nothing connected with that branch of commerce remained in the window, except a sort of small glass lantern containing a languishing mass of bull's-eyes, which had melted in the summer and congealed in the winter until all hope of ever getting them out, or of eating them without eating the lantern too, was gone forever.
He's trying everything he possibly can to get ahead. He's got multiple different kinds of stock in the store. And because he has so much, it seems like he isn't even able to get a start in any direction because he's just too diversified.
Yeah.
But he has so many young children and a wife who's having to find a way to survive, just the day to day. And Mr. Tetterby loves his wife. He describes her as his little woman. They clearly still love each other, but their love continues to produce children. So it's that kind of Victorian conundrum.
Yes. And that idea of it being a slightly distorted projection of Dickens's own household. When they get the curse and they fall out with each other, and Mr. Tetterby thinks of his wife as getting fat, and she thinks of him as getting bald and starting to stoop, and all the children are now a menace around them and everything. Yeah, it's so interesting, isn't it?
It is, because I do think that sometimes Dickens worked out personal things he was dealing with through literature. You see moments from his own life, like, for example, Fanny's death, creeping into his own work as he's going through it himself. Right now, Charles and Catherine were not at the crisis point yet that their marriage would later be in, but they're continuing to have children at regular intervals. And Catherine could not keep up with Dickens and his walks and his exercise. And, she was constantly pregnant. So yes, she's going to be gaining some weight, especially considering how much food they typically used to serve at those Dickens dinners at his house. I do think there is some personal reading here. I think one thing that also struck me is how she describes her marriage as a sacrifice. And her husband takes her up on this. And it actually does something rather amusing, I think, with it, where she says, I do mean that my marriage is a sacrifice. And he says, why? Then I mean to say that there are two sides to that affair and that I was the sacrifice and I wish the sacrifice hadn't been accepted. So they're both trying to act as though their marriage to each other kept them from some other glorious kind of future. And I think we all have this kind of doubt sometimes as to whether the course we took in life or the course that we were able to take in life was the correct one. But back then, if you think about it, marriage was for life. And you might have several suitors as a woman. If you chose the wrong one, that was a lifetime mistake in many cases. And I think it's more daunting when you think of it that way. I don't think it would be quite as impactful today for someone to say, this was a sacrifice, I've doomed myself. But back then,
Hmm.
there's that added element of no divorce, which Dickens himself confronted later in life.
Yeah, of course. And I suppose that no divorce pressure is still within living memory, isn't it? Older generations still alive today know that whole idea of, you save yourself for marriage, you get married, and then you do not divorce. You
Get married,
yeah,
and
you
that's
get,
it.
yeah. And again, that's another very relatable thing, isn't it? That awful moment. And of course, it's not the case that they come under this spell and then they're just awful to each other and unfeeling towards each other. They have regret and shame, and they're upset for feeling the way they do. But yes, when Mrs. Tetterby is talking about all the different suitors she had when she was young, and all the men that she turned down, and some of them are in the army and they're very brave and strong and tall, and you're just small. My husband's small. In fact, the second chapter starts with the word small. I didn't count how many smalls, but it's just constantly small, 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 small.
If you call somebody small over and over again, especially if it's your husband, this is a very cruel thing to say to someone. And just like when he tells his wife, she's fat, she's aging, she won't bear comparison with most other women. I think if someone said that to me, I know what I would do.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
This is the thing you're afraid someone's going to say about yourself. I think what's fascinating about this is I think this was always there. I think Redlaw brought it out. A grievance that they've had for a long time, this doubt that they have about the way their life has gone. I think this is one of the worst parts of the book because it's so relatable. It happens at a breakfast table. And we've seen scenes like this in daily life.
It goes a little bit further than most of our daily experiences, I hope. But yes, definitely, yeah.
That's true.
but it's something else I noticed.
It's a bad day.
It's a very, very bad day. But then it's a good day. Again, it's all so quick, isn't it? It only happens over the course of Christmas Eve into Christmas Day, I think, doesn't it? All of this.
Huh.
Yeah. But also, poignantly in a way, there's the reconciliation with the Tetterbys, isn't there? Where Mr. Tetterby is saying, your life might have been easier if you hadn't married me, actually, because our lives, we worked so hard.
There's a section that for me I think is really fascinating.
Yeah.
That just sort of chills my blood, which is what Dickens loved doing to people. So it begins, when twilight everywhere released the shadows, prisoned up all day, that now closed in and gathered like mustering swarms of ghosts, when they stood lowering in corners of rooms and frowned out from behind half-open doors, when they had full possession of unoccupied apartments, when they danced upon the floors and walls and ceilings of inhabited chambers, while the fire was low, and withdrew like ebbing waters when it sprang into a blaze, when they fantastically mocked the shapes of household objects, making the nurse an ogress, the rocking horse a monster, the wondering child, half scared and half amused, a stranger to itself, the very tongs upon the hearth, a straddling giant with his arms akimbo, evidently smelling the blood of Englishmen and wanting to grind people's bones to make his bread. When these shadows brought into the minds of older people other thoughts and showed them different images, when they stole from their retreats and the likenesses of forms and faces from the past, from the grave, from the deep, deep gulf, where the things that might have been and never were are always wandering. I mean, you come from a nursery to the void between life and death, which, Dickens probably imagines his sister wandering at this point. These shadows have influences. So as the light decreases, they increase. If you increase the light, they spring away. I think that metaphor applies to the attempt to keep yourself cheerful. Because if you don't feed that fire, if you don't make sure that you are dwelling on the positive side of life, if you're not focusing on good things in life, then the shadows will take advantage. They will creep as if it's some kind of natural law into your consciousness.
I love that bit that you just read so much. That was the bit that hooked me when I was reading it, especially that thing about the ghosts that are of things that were and never would be are always wandering. That bit is so great. But also, I feel like he's really rehearsed shadows in previous Christmas books by this point. Obviously the Ghost of Christmas yet to come, but the shadows that point down to Trotty in the climax of the Chimes as well. And here you have, obviously at the start, the shadows as very terrifying. But I think in the end, they have a kind of cheerful appearance, dancing with the children and the families at Christmas time when everything's been resolved well.
Right.
It made me also think that actually nature mirroring Redlaw's inner life and his condition. Right. Because when chapter 3, it's in 3 chapters, isn't it, this one? When chapter 3 starts, it's fantastic, this bit where he goes... Night was still heavy in the sky. On open plains from hilltops and from the decks of solitary ships at sea, a distant low-lying line that promised by and by to change to light was visible in the horizon, but its promise was remote and doubtful, and the moon was striving with the night clouds busily. And then if we didn't get the illusion, it then goes on to say, the shadows upon Redlaw's mind succeeded thick and fast to one another, and obscured its light as the night clouds hovered between the moon and earth, and kept the latter veiled in darkness. So this heavenly struggle going on is happening for Redlaw as well, where he's got the curse, but he sees there are these breaks in the clouds. He can latch onto something, and then it disappears again. I just think that's...
Right.
So you have the promise of dawn, but it's still doubtful. Yeah,
Right.
It's great, isn't it?
Well, it's wonderful. I mean, he wrote to William Bradbury that he spent 3 days crying his eyes out over it after he finished it. And he said he did it not painfully, but pleasantly. And then he kept writing to different people about his experience, what the meaning of it was. He seemed to be very anxious that people could understand it, at least when they read it. So he wrote, of course, my point is that bad and good are inextricably linked in remembrance, and that you could not choose the enjoyment of recollecting only the good to have all the best of it. You must remember the worst also. So, people have read it. They want to talk to him about it. He's like, no. This is the message right here that you need to get. The whole idea that memory is the good and the bad. So I think he really loved this book.
Yeah. Of course, it's so interesting to hear that about him crying for days afterwards. And it's the only story that I can recall in this moment where whenever towards the end Redlaw essentially collapses with his face in his hands sobbing, you go, yes, he's free, he's done it. This is a good thing to happen. In most other fiction, that would be a total tragedy, and you'd want to get them away from that. You're pushing him towards a breakdown, basically, to find himself again. And that quote's so good as well. There's another moment that really struck me, and talking about where if you lose the negative, you only have the positive, you end up with essentially blanks in existence. And with those blanks, you can't understand anything. You can't connect with anything properly. You can't empathize. You can't, we don't go around hitting people when we're frustrated with them, because we have some sense, I think, of actually that it actually really hurts, what it actually means to be hit. We have enough in our experience of pain, Trying to, I suppose, explain the phantom, Redlaw's ghostly double, would be quite interesting. But the other thing to say as an extra point is that it did occur to me reading at this time that the spirit world in this story is so contained. It's linking to what you've said before. It's so contained inside. So Millie, she carries something very powerful and supernatural inside her. And I feel like old Philip does as well. The way he holds up the holly and the way he talks to Redlaw. And he's almost like Redlaw's last chance to not make a terrible mistake with the Phantom when he's about to leave the room, saying, no, Lord, keep my memory green and all of that. So, so what do you think on all of that? First, I suppose first Redlaw's double, and then, but also Millie's double appears, doesn't she, at one point with Redlaw's Phantom as well. So it's, you try and pin these things down. I get confused asking the questions. So good luck with the answers.
The reason why I think it's so difficult to ask questions or answer questions with this book is that it's so circular, and there are many different contrasts that are being set up at the same time. For example, you mentioned how the old man is sort of using that adjuration, Lord, keep my memory green, his eternal prayer, which is probably one of the first things that he remembers. It's sort of a routine that people have had for a long time around Christmas. So it might seem that has been effective. And then there's this horrible scene where the chemist leaves, and it says, as he fell a musing in his chair alone, the healthy holly withered on the wall and dropped dead branches. So here we have Redlaw sitting there, literally shriveling up the holly around him. So this is the first time we see the ghost. Before then, we felt the chill in the atmosphere, but it's almost as though it sort of has to feed on something that is healthy and cheerful in order to manifest. So it's almost like magic. The price is shriveling up the holly on the wall, and then there it is, sort of taking human form. But I don't think it's totally evil, at least by the end of this piece. So the Phantom basically works him up into this feeling of desperation where he is willing to accept this gift. Redlaw refers to him as the tempter. almost echoes some words from A Christmas Carol, whose hollow look and voice I dread more than words can express. That's very much like what Scrooge would say to the ghost of Christmas future. But there also seems to be some doubt as to whether this is actually a manifestation of himself or if there's some other kind of agency involved here, which I think is fascinating because obviously a manifestation of his depression. But there's also an aspect to the spectre where perhaps it's not so much a tempter as an angel because it's showing him how this will work, And then by the end of this, it basically allows him to reverse this curse, to have his own life back. So I don't think it's a wholly evil situation.
No, again, you're so right. Yes, we should get to that moment also as well, because that's quite perplexing to understand how that comes about. But there's a key moment where you have the feral child, the ignorant and want child, devil child, sleeping crouched by the fire, and the phantom reappears visibly to Redlaw, holding a phantom representation of the angelic Millie. In that moment, that startling moment, because I have to say, every time I pick this book up and read it, I just go, I'm sorry, what? And there's always something that starts a whole chain of thought that I'm trying to understand. But in that moment, what do you take from that moment? Does that tie into what you're saying about the role of the phantom and its behavior?
For the most part, it's this very dangerous, evil kind of representation at first. And then towards the end, when he brings the image of Millie in there, it's more positive. It's more like what the ghost of Christmas Present would have done, I think. Less darkness, more opportunity. And so the Phantom says, when the morning shines, seek out the reality whose image I present before you. Is it my inexorable doom to do so? Cried the chemist. It is, replied the Phantom. To destroy her peace, her goodness, to make her what I am myself and what I have made of others? I have said seek her out, returned the Phantom. I have said no more. It's very mysterious, and I think it's almost as if the Phantom doesn't want to say too much to Redlaw because Redlaw has to work it out. Just in the way that Scrooge with the ghost of Christmas future has to sort of reach this internal realization. If the Phantom says it, if the Phantom articulates what Redlaw should realize or articulate, then the lesson is lost. The Phantoms are always listening for that moment of repentance.
Phantoms! Punishers of impious thoughts, cried Redlaw, gazing round in anguish. Look upon me! From the darkness of my mind, let the glimmering of contrition that I know is there shine up and show my misery. In the material world, as I have long taught, nothing can be spared. No step or atom in the wondrous structure could be lost without a blank being made in the great universe. I know now that it is the same with good and evil, happiness and sorrow in the memories of men. Relieve me. Undo what I have done. Leave me benighted, but restore the day to those whom I have cursed.
So the Phantom explains to the chemist why this boy seems to be immune to the influence, because he's the only person so far who isn't infected. And it's confusing to the reader the first time through, I think, especially why the boy has no ill effects or doesn't seem to change in some way. So the Phantom explains.
This, said the Phantom, pointing to the boy, is the last, completest illustration of a human creature utterly bereft of such remembrances as you have yielded up. No softening memory of sorrow, wrong, or trouble enters here, because this wretched mortal from his birth has been abandoned to a worse condition than the beasts, and has, within his knowledge, no one contrast, no humanizing touch to make a grain of such a memory spring up in his hardened breast. Woe tenfold to the nation that shall count its monsters such as this lying here by hundreds and by thousands.
So in one way, the Phantom sort of turns around and looks at Britain and is like, hey, this, just like in A Christmas Carol, this is what you are churning out. The reason why the boy isn't changing is because he has no good memories. There's nothing there to work with. There's no opposite thing. If you take away the bad memories, well, that is all the memory of this child. I think it's a bit confusing, but the point Dickens is making is everyone else in the story has good memories, but this poor child. And I think so that's Redlaw's moment of thinking, maybe I don't have it so terribly compared to some of these other people. I've met someone in a worse condition than myself. And so I think that kind of begins the final realization that he has some work to do socially and not so much internally.
Something else about the Phantom that's interesting is when Redlaw is frustrated or angry with him in the first scene, he goes to strike him or grab him by the throat, I think, and the Phantom says something along the lines of, "You kill me, you kill yourself," which again adds yet another layer of mystery. "Mocker," said the chemist, leaping up and making with a wrathful hand at the throat of his other self. "Forbear," exclaimed the spectre in an awful voice. "Lay a hand on me and die." Something else that really struck me reading it this time, and it always has actually, I think, is that moment where Mrs. Tetterby is talking about going around the shops, and what a dark contrast to all the love of all the things that are for sale in A Christmas Carol when you wander around the shops. Then here she's talking about her stock of money being too small to purchase anything. Right. This being Christmas time, when all people who can make holiday, and when all people who have got money like to spend some. I did, somehow, get a little out of sorts when I was in the streets just now. There were so many things to be sold, such delicious things to eat, such fine things to look at, such delightful things to have. And there was so much calculating and calculating necessary before I durst lay out a sixpence for the commonest thing. And the basket was so large and wanted so much in it, and my stock of money was so small, and would go such a little way. So much there on sale, and she's not able to afford any of it. And then, of course, there's that pressure to do special things for Christmas, to have the money to do that. And that really cuts through to our time. It's probably even worse these days. Something I notice is the repetition of the gesture of the hand kind of passing across the forehead, either when it's infecting you or when it's leaving you, which is so interesting again, isn't it? And trying to work out how that works, just that gesture. And when Mrs. Tetterby's really out of sorts being married to her husband, she turns the wedding ring around on her finger. All of that is so... the imagery is so powerful, isn't it? That every time I pick it up, I find something new.
Well, Dickens is doing something similar to how I see modern novelists sometimes writing. And it makes me laugh sometimes when you're reading a book, Book of the Month Club, something that's on that New York Times bestseller list on my side of things. And you read a scene and the author wrote that scene for the hopeful film adaptation. And some of the conventions, some of the imagery, it's just like, you saw this as the Netflix episode, didn't you? So Dickens is doing the same thing with this. He is writing it for the stage. He's writing it in a way that can be transferred very easily, almost stage directions. If someone's turning their wedding ring and looking concerned, I think we would make an assumption that it wasn't just a nervous, gesture. This is about the ring being turned on your finger, the doubt of whether you want to take it off or not. This actually was put on stage, I think, the day after it was published. The whole point is Dickens knows this is going to be put on stage. I think this works so well for us in terms of reading it because we can actually see the characters' gestures, their placement, their reactions to each other in a way that transfers fairly well to the stage.
Yep. There's something else that I really love about this is the Christmas music that runs through it that's invisible. I mean, as in you're never there. It's always happening outside or across the way. You never see the Christmas waits, the carol singers there, and music is so important to the changes in Redlaw, bringing him back to himself in the end. The Christmas music he had heard before began to play. He listened to it at first, as he had listened in the churchyard. But presently, it playing still and being borne towards him on the night air in a low, sweet, melancholy strain, he rose and stood stretching his hands about him as if there was some friend approaching within his reach on whom his desolate touch might rest, yet not do harm. As he did this, his face became less fixed and wandering. A gentle trembling came upon him, And at last his eyes filled with tears, and he put his hands before them and bowed down his head. His memory of sorrow, wrong, and trouble had not come back to him. He knew that it was not restored. He had no passing belief or hope that it was. But some dumb stir within him made him capable again of being moved by what was hidden, afar off, in the music. If it were only that it told him sorrowfully the value of what he had lost, he thanked heaven for it, with a fervent gratitude. As the last chord died upon his ear, he raised his head to listen to its lingering vibration. Perhaps my parting question for you, Lydia, is this. Does it make you feel Christmassy when you've got to the end and you've been through all the trauma and the drama of it?
I don't know if it makes me feel Christmassy, but I think we've lost a lot of that association of Christmas as being in a way like All Hallows Eve. Dickens celebrated the 12 days of Christmas, so we have a lot of records from him reappraising his life on New Year's, especially in I think the 1838 diary, which we have. He talks about his life. He's beginning a new year. He's excited about it, but also he's still dealing with depression. And I think for many people, Christmas was a time of reevaluation. Also, just like today, it's usually a time that puts you in a house with your relatives, which may or may not be the best thing in the entire world for your mental health. And so I think in that sense, it is extremely Christmassy. I think it's a time where you have to confront yourself and where you've come in life. It's a sort of milestone. But I think A Christmas Carol will always be the definitive Christmas feeling because it has so many scenes of Christmas celebration. I think if it weren't for The Ghost of Christmas Present, we might look at it in a similar way to this, which is so much about the duty you have to keep yourself cheerful and care about your society. But yes, not entirely a Christmas thing for me. I don't think it has quite enough Christmas cheer, but I do like it. This is a really...
No, I like it too. Yeah, it's a darker Christmas, isn't it? But it's very jolly at the end. As they were assembled in the old hall, by no other light than that of a great fire, having dined early, the shadows once more stole out of their hiding places and danced about the room, showing the children marvellous shapes and faces on the walls, and gradually changing what was real and familiar there to what was wild and magical. But that there was one thing in the hall to which the eyes of Redlaw, and of Millie, and her husband, and of the old man, and of the student and his bride that was to be, were often turned, which the shadows did not obscure or change. Deepened in its gravity by the firelight, and gazing from the darkness of the panelled wall like life, the sedate face in the portrait, with the beard and ruff, looked down at them from under its verdant wreath of holly, as they looked up at it, and clear and plain below, as if a voice had uttered them, were the words, "Lord, keep my memory green." Lydia, thank you so much. It's been so great to meet you and talk to you about this one. It's such a great, I recommend it. I absolutely recommend it to anyone that's not read it. So thank you again. It's been brilliant. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks for asking me.
Not at all. Bye for now.
Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas. Bye. Thank you for listening to Charles Dickens' A Brain on Fire this Christmas. If you're enjoying these episodes and would like to make a small donation to cover the costs of producing them, please go to the description wherever you're listening to this and you can buy a coffee. Every one of those that is bought makes a huge difference. Thank you so much, and see you in the new year.